What's up, everybody? This is Super Scudge. I want to just give a brief lesson, I guess, on a particular variable that this game uses. The RAM value is, of course, 7E0B08, but that doesn't really mean much to most people. This is a variable that the game uses to control rotations and angles of arcs for some round-shaped things. This variable is used by Armos, for example, and also by Argus for the spins around his baby Argai. Trinex's attacks, since they're round-shaped, also apparently use it, and also the Ganon Firebat circle. The Armos fight is actually the only fight that clears this variable before the fight starts, which is why the Armos fight always plays out exactly the same. However, the variable is stored into its RAM address and then forgotten about, either until you get to another Armos fight, which would reset it again, or until you get to another fight that uses it, which would use it from whatever value it's set to. So on this save state that I have, it just happens to be set to this random number, 45056. That's a decimal value. It's a 2-byte value, but I don't know how to make a hex value show on a Lewis script. And I didn't feel like spending much time figuring it out, but that doesn't really matter for the purpose of this demonstration. And all I really want to show is the relationship between the variable in regard to the Armos fight and to the Ganon fight. The Armos 2 fight, which is the last fight that uses the variable before Ganon, and then as far as I know, nothing in between affects it at all. So yeah, first I just want to kind of show how this plays out in the Armos fight. As soon as this fight starts, you'll see the variable change. That happens at the beginning of every Armos fight. It always changes to the exact same value in order to start the rotation correctly. I'm going to move to the corner just to get out of the way, just so we can watch it happen. As soon as they start moving, switches to 447. The high value of the variable here is actually 448. 447 is the sort of the launching point from which they start their clockwise rotation. When the variable is at 447, the game's going to wait for the Armos to get into their starting positions for the rotation before starting. Now we already know this happens because we know we can stun lock them, keep them out of their starting position, and prevent the rotation cycle from starting for as long as we want, or until, you know, they're all able to get, all living Armos are able to get into their starting position. So after this, once they get into their starting position, it's going to start counting down as they move clockwise, all the way until they move in and then outward one time, and then they stop rotating. When they stop rotating, it locks at the low value of 64, and then they continue their cycle. When they're ready to start the counterclockwise rotation, the value will change to 65, like that, and then they'll wait until they're able to get into position to start their rotation, their counterclockwise rotation, where it counts upward. So yeah, that's kind of how that variable is used in this fight. So I'll try to have a successful fight here, so I can show the outcome. One more thing actually I should probably show before moving on. If you have a generally successful fight with a pretty significant variance to timing, see if the timer is at 186. It was counting down because they were making a clockwise rotation, but it actually continues to count down even after they're dead, and then it locks at the low value. This is because there's an invisible sprite here, kind of thing, an overlord sprite, which controls the other 6 Armos. It's a 7th Armos sprite that can't be interacted with, it can't be killed or anything, and it's always alive. So as long as it's alive in this room, it's going to continue trying to, you know, to make the rotation cycles happen. And interestingly enough, because no living Armos are out of position, in several seconds you'll see it'll start counting back up again. That's because it's doing the counterclockwise cycle now. So that continues to happen as long as you're in the same room, and by room I mean underworld tile. That means if you're in this room or in this room, then it would continue to change and cycle, as you can see there. So with nearly every timing to this fight, even if you mess it up a little bit, if there's any variance without a huge margin of error, in fact I can even intentionally mess up the fight a little bit to show how slow you can be and still get this exact same value locked in here. Oops, I accidentally let the armless get red. Even with that timing, I can still come up here, get the key, get the arrows, and have time to mirror out before it even changes again. There's no way to go too fast to where you are able to mirror out before the value sets to the low value. If you leave the room while it's counting down, it won't continue to count down and lock into position as it does if you're inside the room. So if I were to finish this fight and then just get out of here, it'll get stuck at whatever value it's at. But if you take the time to get the key, then it is almost guaranteed to be 64 at the time that you mirror out, and it locks at that position until the Ganon fight. It was noted that sometimes you got an unusual fire bat cycle when fighting Ganon, and that it seemed to happen more frequently in the any % no EG category. And my theory for why it seems to happen more often in that category is because high-level runners, who would be more likely to notice a difference in the pattern, are also more likely to get red mail in any % no EG than they would be in a normal run. So if you mess up the fight even a little bit and come up here, get these items, make your way back through this room to get the red mail, then there's a chance that it'll start to count back up again. So yeah, see how close that was? If there was any error in the fight at all, or if I had any trouble getting into the door after the fight, then it would have started to count up again before I was able to hit these stairs. And that'll cause an unusual cycle on Ganon. So nearly all conditions from this fight will result in the same variable, which will cause the same cycle on Ganon. You may have noticed that I'm doing a not optimal strat here. I'm actually doing a strat that's a little bit slower. So you might think that if you do a faster strat, you might be able to get to the chest and mirror out before it was able to count down to the low value there. But the slow strat actually delays the triggering of the movement cycle for a longer period of time. It delays the initial rotation, which means that the initial rotation actually counts down less with the slow strat, so you're actually more likely to beat the countdown with the slow strat than with the fast strat. And since I've tazzed this fight, you know, it's impossible to beat that countdown, even with the most optimal thing you can do here, aside from keeping them out of rotation for a very long time. Alright, so I want to show the rotation cycle for different values in this variable here. So what I'll show is the normal one, which is this one, 64. I'll show what happens if you go very slow and it counts all the way back up to the top. But also an important one to show is what happens if you reset the console, because a lot of people practice Ganon, you know, with a complete file. They power on their console, they see a complete file, they say, you know what, I'm going to practice Ganon before I do a couple runs. And the rotation cycle is actually not going to be the same as the one that you would normally get in a run. Now that doesn't necessarily have an impact on the outcome of the fight. You know, depending on what strats you do on each RNG, that may actually be completely irrelevant. But it is worth noting. It may affect your practice, so I will show the difference in the patterns for that reason. Alright, so the value started counting down here. It counts down really fast from 64 down to 0, and it's going to continue counting down as he starts to do this cycle. I'm going to use frame advance so you can see it's jumping by four values per frame, so it's counting down really fast. The position he lands in isn't really relevant for the purposes of seeing this effect, it's always going to be the same as long as he's facing in the same direction. There's a glitched warp where he'll face down during this phase, but there's no reason to show that. So you'll see he starts spinning his trident, the value keeps changing, and that'll determine the arc at which the fire bats begin to spawn, when they're just fireballs before they turn into bats, and subsequently how they become bats. So you see it spawns above him, a little bit angled to the right there. Let this play out as they spawn, and then continue cycling until the fire bats are ready to spawn, and then they begin to spawn from the bottom right, I guess. So that's the normal fire bat pattern. Under nearly all circumstances, that's the pattern that you're going to see in a speedrun. Okay, so this is the the top number in the cycle. So this is what would happen if you had a very bad fight. I showed even if you get a red Armos that you still have a huge window to get out with the variable still at the normal value. So this would happen if, the fight goes so bad that, you have to slash it. You run out of arrows, you have to slash your sword to kill him. Or if the fight goes pretty bad and you get the red mail and subsequently delay the cycle until it's able to get to this point. If it happens on any individual number in between, it's, the results are going to be less predictable. But like I showed, the upper and lower values have such a huge range of time when they stick on those values that those are still the most likely ones that you're going to see. Ideally, you mostly see the good one. Alright, when he starts spinning his trident, the number starts counting down, again jumping by a large amount, so it drops very quickly. You'll see where the original fireball spawns. This time it's in the bottom right instead of in the top, a little bit to the right as it was before. So I guess if the rotation is consistent, then the first fire bat should spawn on the bottom left of him after the expansion and contraction of the circle. Which I think is correct. Yeah, there it goes. Bottom left, a little closer to the left side. So you can see how it just offsets around the circle. It's a correlative effect, I guess. Obviously, because it's just a timer on a rotation. So yeah, those are the two standards that you might see. But like I said, it's important to understand that if you start a file, if I reset the emulator to reset this value, there we go. It'll reset to 0 because it hasn't been initialized yet because the RAM is cleared. It's not going to be initialized by any of the other fights that use it because we're going to be starting with Ganon. Okay, so I reset the game through the emulator, which clears the RAM values. So now this value is set to 0. Hasn't been initialized yet. I haven't been in any fight that would initialize it. So the Ganon fight is just going to start its pattern, which is just subtracting 4 every frame from 0. So we'll see what pattern we get if we do this. Again, the only reason this is important really is because if you practice Ganon from a completed file, then the pattern is going to be different. Well, you can still get good practice. I also mentioned, it might not be impactful depending on what strats you use or, how you play out the fight. It's still relevant, it's still worth noting, but if you don't have any better way to practice, then obviously, do whatever you can. Oops. Alright, I'm gonna see where this fireball spawns. I think it's to the right of him. Yeah, so that's where it starts, waiting to the expansion and contraction again, so we can see where the fire bats start. Should be in the bottom, a little bit to the left, I guess. This is where they're gonna start to spawn. Yeah, so that's where they started spawning. So that's the difference that can be caused by this variable in the gain and fight, given a few different circumstances. You know, so yeah, under nearly all conditions in a normal run, if you don't mess up Armos very badly, or mess it up a little bit and get the red mail, then you're almost always going to have the correct value here, which is 64, and you're always going to have the same pattern on Ganon, assuming you don't get the glitched warp, where he would be facing down. So if that happens, then you know the fight's kind of screwy anyway. So yeah, I think that's all I really wanted to go into for this specifically. Obviously, this affects other things. As I mentioned, it affects Argus and Trinex, but not really in a predictable or really impactful way. You know, Trinex should never really get a chance to attack. If he does, he puts a little ice on the ground. You don't worry about it. Argus maybe gets one attack cycle. You're going to react to it the same no matter what. You're just going to try to pick out the puffs. You don't really think about the arc of his attack when he attacks. So yeah, I hope this was informative, although kind of boring, surely, because it's all, you know, theoretical stuff like a lecture. But hopefully if you were interested in learning something today, then you did learn something today.